Hey YouTube, I'm Nate and welcome to my channel. Before we get started, new channel, new videos, new algorithm view. Like, share, subscribe. Please, engagement helps. But with that said, today I'd like to talk to you about the Tomorrow War and how it's really not that bad of a movie. So over the weekend, I had a chance to watch the Tomorrow War starring Chris Pratt. Admittedly, I was a little weary going into this movie because I'd read reviews that basically called it Starship Troopers for dummies. And Starship Troopers, a very misunderstood movie.
It must be because I'm big and dumb.
So looking at the two movies, Starship Troopers, The Tomorrow War, they really have nothing in common other than aliens and guns. I mean, that's fucking it. Aliens and guns. We're going to start with a general synopsis of the plot, and then we'll move into my thoughts overall. So our movie opens with Dan Forrester, played by Chris Pratt. He's talking on the phone, telling the person on the other end about his experience as a soldier and how he worked in the Army research labs, which sparked him to use his GI Bill, get an education, and now he's a high school biology teacher with aspirations to be a researcher. So after getting his rejection, he sits down on his couch and is watching the World Cup with his daughter Murray. During the World Cup, this weird-ass disturbance pops up, startling everybody at the game. And out pops these black-clad soldiers who then make an announcement to the world.
We are fighting a war 30 years in the future.
It's a joke.
Our enemy is not human. We need you to fight.
So we come to find out that 30 years in the future, humanity is fighting an alien species they call the White Spikes. These White Spikes are utterly decimating the population, and by the time we get to the movie, there's less than 500,000 surviving people on the planet. They've come back to ask us, present-day humanity, to go to the future and help them fight this war. Now, the dumbass politicians, fucking idiots, they're like, oh, well, let's go ahead and send our military to the future. Why? I don't know. Being armed with the knowledge that we're about to be utterly fucked is probably good enough for me to start making preparations and training the world's military to be ready for the White Spikes. But, plot. And so we send our armed forces 30 years into the future. And of the armed forces, only about half of them were eligible to be sent to the future, and I'll explain why here in a minute. They go on 7-day deployments, meaning you have to do one deployment of a week. If you survive, you come back, you're good to go. Well, we find out only about 20% of those initial waves of the military survived their tour of duty. This causes the world to institute a worldwide draft, pulling in untrained civilians to essentially be fucking cannon fodder for whatever goddamn reason. And so we cut to a year later, and Dan is in class teaching his students his topic. They're bored, they're depressed because, again, only a fifth of the people that go to the future come back alive. And as he's in the middle of this lecture, his phone goes off. He's been ordered to report to the MEP station. He's been drafted. So he sits down at the intake, and they're doing a test. And this test is really just looking at data from the future to find out when he dies. It turns out that you have to essentially be dead when the war starts to be sent to the future, presumably to prevent some kind of a paradox being created, but honestly, the paradox has already been created, so 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, really. Dan then gets this big armband looking thing attached to his wrist surgically. We find out that that's called a jump band. It allows them to track him anywhere in the world, and it's also responsible for facilitating his jump to and from the future. They tell Dan that if you run, you will be imprisoned, and someone from your family may take your place, greatly insinuating that his wife or daughter, 9-year-old daughter, could take his place. So at the prompting of his wife Emmy, played by Yvonne Strahovski, which if I pronounce that wrong, I apologize, she encourages him to go visit his dad, who can potentially remove his armband. Well, the visit goes south, and he declares that good old dad is never going to know his granddaughter, and then storms out. So we cut to a heartfelt moment between Dan and his daughter Muri, where he accidentally cuts a cable and then bribes her, great dad, to not tell on him for doing it. And then he tells her about his draft status, and she is not happy, naturally. So the next day, Dan begins his orientation where he meets two characters, Charlie and Dorian. They're going to be important later. Remember those names. It's discovered that Charlie lost his wife in the first draft for the future war, and that Dorian has also been on multiple tours to the future, which makes him fucking psychotic, essentially. So during the character building moment, an alarm goes off. And it turns out that a research facility in future Miami is under attack by the White Spikes. So our future soldiers are assembled and prepped for jump. Well, during the jump, something happens, and they're deposited hundreds of feet above the Miami ground. And they were only supposed to be dropped 5 to 10 feet above ground, and they're hundreds. So you can kind of understand what's about to happen. Splat. But with his plot armor, Chris Pratt lands in a pool, even having dropped over 100 feet. Dorian and Charlie obviously survive because they have plot armor for the moment. Remember, only our protagonist gets full movie plot armor. The other two, we'll get there. Once they've landed, we actually get our first long-distance view of the White Spikes via a reflection in binoculars. And honestly, I felt like they did a pretty good job of show, don't tell, at least in this specific scenario. So our team makes their way into the research facility where they're tasked with recovering the researchers and biomaterial and data related to the White Spike research. Shit hits the fan, they have to beat a hasty retreat through a stairwell. Now it's in this stairwell that we get our first up-close look at White Spikes, and they're pretty fucking terrifying, I'm not gonna lie. They're these big, multiple-footed, lizard-like creatures with two tentacles coming out of them that shoots bone spikes, and that's scary. Especially if you're a Halo fan and you fought the Flood in Halo 3. Flashbacks to my teen years, for sure. So our team promptly fucks off and gets the hell out of Miami as it's being bombarded from air in an effort to sterilize it and kill as many White Spikes as humanly possible. So Dan, Dorian, and Charlie wake back up at a forward operating base. And this is where Dan discovers that the colonel he's been talking to on comms the whole time is his daughter, played by Yvonne Strahovski. For the Handmaid's Tale fans, it's Serena Waterford. So she invites him on a last-ditch mission to capture a queen, which has proved immune to their attempts to essentially kill them with specific toxins. So the mission succeeds and they retreat out to the jump facility in the Bahamas. Dan and Muri begin experimenting on the queen to try to find a toxin that's going to kill her. Muri's plan is to find a toxin that can kill off the White Spikes, including the queens, because they had previously developed one and it did a good job of killing the males, but the female somehow purged it from her body. So we find out the plan is to take this toxin and send it back to the past with Dan for them to mass produce it and be ready to fight the White Spikes when they emerge in our timeline. Dan refuses, essentially, and says he's going to come back with enough to help them fight them off in the future. We find out at this point that that's really not going to happen because the facility comes under attack from the White Spikes and Muri ends up dying in the process. Dan successfully jumps back to the past and attempts to bargain to go back to the future. Jump facility's been destroyed. Humanity is presumed extinct in the future. Sitting at home, Dan talks to his wife, and they come to the realization that the White Spikes were probably already there. So he assembles the team. Dorian, Charlie, and his dad, they head out to Russia. And in Russia, they find a crashed spaceship several hundred feet under the ice. They take this toxin in, which they manage to get mass-produced, or at least produced in a large enough quantity for them to use it in this ship. And they start killing white spikes. But this wakes them up. Big battle ensues. Queen escapes. They track her down. But in the ship, the battle becomes unmanageable. And so Dorian detonates a metric fuck ton of C4 and just destroys the shit out of the ship. Although, when you look at the size of the explosion, you also get kind of a picture of how big the ship was. I don't think the C4 they used was enough, but I'll get to that. After the ship blows, Dan, Charlie, and James, his father, are outside fighting these white spikes. It's discovered that the queen has escaped, and they go to chase her down. A big fight ensues. Dan injects her with the toxin. She dies. Future is saved. Yay! And there we have it. That's the Tomorrow War. Now, obviously, I've skipped some parts of the plot, but we're going to discuss those. So first and foremost, I want to address something that I'm sure a few of you picked up while watching the movie or listening to me. I believe in this movie universe that we're dealing with a multiverse, and my reasoning behind this. As the movie progresses, it becomes very clear that none of the future characters, not a damn one, mentions the future war from their childhood. And since we know that a lot of the people from the future were kids in the present day, Muri being our example, this means that they're not just jumping into their past. What they're actually doing is either they're jumping into the past of a different timeline, or their attempts to jump into the past create a branching timeline where it's completely separate from the original timeline, which we've seen in a few movies, some video games, and some TV shows, so not an overly uncommon thing to see. But the thing that really kind of perplexes me is I want to know whether this timeline did exist prior to the jump link, or if the jump link is what created the branching timeline. It's never explained. So if there's a sequel to the movie, we might find that out. But now the plot as a whole really isn't that bad. And the end of movie twist, it was decent, if not a little bit overused. And that's the "they're already here" trope. And you see that a lot, especially in like really shitty movies like Pandorum. Fucking hated that movie. But the cinematography I thought was done very well. I really, really enjoyed how they visually represented the wormhole to transport them into the future. I thought it was very visually stunning. Scientifically speaking, I'm not the guy to ask if that's an accurate representation of a wormhole, especially considering I'm a Stargate fan. No wormholes look right to me if it's not a Stargate. Just how shit is. So, like I said, J.K. Simmons plays Chris Pratt's dad. And he did very believably sell "I'm estranged from my family." However, and I do mean no disrespect to anyone that has experienced PTSD, but seriously, Hollywood, I am fucking tired of the Vietnam vet who left the family out of nobility because dealing with their PTSD would have been worse than them being gone. It's a tired trope, and I want to see it die. Don't get me wrong, vet support is not good, especially here in the US. And more specifically, it was even worse in the Vietnam era, so it is believable that James didn't get the support he needed and felt that it was necessary to leave his family. But still, it's a tired trope, and it really was not entirely necessary to the plot. I think it was written in just to create some more dramatic tension. Honestly, I would have much rathered J.K. Simmons be like a paranoid person, a doomsday prepper, one of those people, or just a military hardware aficionado. The ultimately they went with the vet story, which is fine. It didn't make the movie worse. I just felt that it was a little misplaced. Especially considering the back quarter of the movie, it low-key became about James redeeming himself in his estranged family's eyes. But with all of that said, I'll reiterate what I said earlier. I liked this movie, and I thought it was maybe slightly above average in terms of quality. But to be fair, I like most sci-fi movies without any major judgment. My favorite movie type, those shitty sci-fi B movies you watch at like 2 o'clock in the morning on the Sci-Fi Channel. I fucking love them. The dumber they are, like, the more engaging I find them. But we could potentially see a sequel in this movie. In the final sequence, the White Spikes begin escaping their pods. And in the movie, they do mention that the Queen got off the ship. However, we don't know if there were other ways out, so blowing the ship may not have killed all of them. Not to mention, there's the sci-fi trope of the Queen was carrying an egg that just so happened to be another queen, and poof, Future War II. But I sincerely do hope there is a sequel. Only time will tell. But regardless, it was a fun movie, and if you're an Amazon Prime member, you seriously lose nothing at all by taking a couple of hours on your weekend and watching it. But once again, I'm a sci-fi fan, so it's very hard for me to utterly dislike a movie unless it's fucking Pandorum, and god damn it, I hate that fucking movie. I detest it. It is the only movie in this world that I just utterly hate. I refuse to watch it a second time. Maybe I'll do a review of that movie when the channel hits 1,000 subs or some shit. I don't know. But in the meantime, if you like this movie, do me a solid. Hit like, hit share, subscribe, or some shit, I don't care. But I'll catch you guys on the next one. Leave a comment below letting me know what movie you'd like to hear about next. Later, y'all.